Margaret pushed her cart through the familiar aisles of Costco, checking items off her Saturday shopping list. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she navigated toward the bakery section. At 67, she had perfected the art of weekend errands, filling the quiet hours that stretched between her morning coffee and evening news. A shopping cart slammed into hers from behind. "Oh God, I'm so sorry." The voice was young, male, genuinely apologetic. Margaret turned to face the teenager responsible. Her breath caught in her throat. The boy couldn't have been more than 15 or 16, with dark hair that fell across his forehead just like her son David's had at that age. But it wasn't just the hair. It was the eyes. The shape of his face. The way he tilted his head slightly when he spoke. Are you okay?" The boy's voice wavered with concern. Margaret's eyes fixed on a small scar above his left eyebrow. A tiny crescent moon, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. Her hand instinctively moved to touch the same spot on her own face, where her grandmother's scar had been. Where David's was. Where her father's had been before him. Yes, I'm fine," she managed. The boy's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and stepped away slightly as he answered. "Mom, I'm getting the cake now." "Yeah, for Dad's 45th birthday." I know, don't forget the candles." Margaret's sneeze nearly gave out. David had just turned 45 2 weeks ago. She'd sent a card to the Australian post office box, like she had every year for 15 years. The boy ended his call and looked back at her with those familiar eyes. "Really sorry about your cart, Have a good day." Margaret watched him walk away, noting the confident stride that belonged to the men in her family. Her cart remained motionless as shoppers flowed around her. She needed to follow him. Something deep in her chest, some maternal instinct that had been dormant for over a decade, demanded she move. She abandoned her cart and trailed the boy through the store, keeping her distance. At the checkout line, she heard him laugh at something the cashier said. That laugh. She'd heard it echo through her house for 18 years before David left for college. The boy loaded his purchases into a silver Honda Civic in the parking lot. Margaret hurried to her own car, her hands shaking as she started the engine. She followed at a safe distance as the Honda pulled out of the lot and onto the main road. 20 minutes later, the car turned into a residential neighborhood Margaret recognized. She'd driven through these streets before, taking scenic routes to avoid highway traffic. The Honda pulled into the driveway of a modest 2-story house with blue shutters and a well-maintained lawn. Margaret parked across the street and watched. The boy carried grocery bags to the front door. A woman opened it before he could knock. Even from this distance, Margaret knew that silhouette. Jennifer. Her daughter-in-law, who was supposed to be living in Australia with David and their son. Margaret's vision blurred. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles went white. 15 years. 15 years of believing her only grandchild was on the other side of the world. 15 years of letters to a foreign post office box. 15 years of wondering if her grandson would grow up knowing her voice, her stories, her love. And they lived 20 minutes away. A dark blue sedan pulled into the driveway. Margaret's heart stopped completely as the driver's door opened and her son David stepped out. Older now, his hair thinning slightly at the temples, but unmistakably her boy. Her firstborn. The child she'd rocked through countless nights, whose scraped knees she'd bandaged, whose dreams she'd listened to over Sunday morning pancakes. David grabbed a briefcase from his car and walked toward the house where his wife and son waited. Where they'd been waiting, apparently, for 15 years. Less than 20 minutes from the house where Margaret had raised him. The front door closed behind the three of them, sealing Margaret out of the scene like she'd been sealed out of their lives. That evening, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with 15 years' worth of records spread before her. Birthday cards sent to the Australian address. Christmas gifts. Money transfers for Adam's education fund, as Jennifer had requested in her few, carefully worded emails over the years. Thousands of dollars sent across the world to help with expenses while David built his career in Sydney. She picked up her phone and dialed the Australian number she'd been calling for years. The same recording she'd heard hundreds of times played back. "This number is no longer in service." Jennifer had always explained that Australian phone systems didn't connect well with American carriers. Margaret had accepted this explanation because she'd wanted to believe it. Because the alternative was too painful to consider. She opened her laptop and began typing the address she'd memorized that afternoon. Street View confirmed what she'd seen in person. The house with blue shutters. David's car in the driveway. A basketball hoop mounted above the garage door where her grandson had probably learned to shoot free throws. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for her purse. She pulled out the last photo she had of Adam, taken when he was 6 months old, just before the move to Australia. A chubby-cheeked baby with dark hair and eyes that seemed to look directly at her through the camera lens. She compared it to her memory of the teenager from Costco. The same eyes. The same expression of gentle curiosity. The same family scar. The weight of 15 lost years pressed against her chest until she could barely breathe. 15 birthdays she'd missed. 15 Christmases. First days of school, lost teeth, scraped knees, bedtime stories. Piano recitals or soccer games or school plays. Driver's education. First dates. The everyday moments that make up a childhood, all of them experienced without her. Margaret closed her eyes and let herself imagine what might have been. Teaching Adam to bake her famous chocolate chip cookies. Reading him the same fairy tales she'd read to David. Watching him open presents on Christmas morning. Being the grandmother she'd always planned to be. Tomorrow, she decided, she would go to that house. She would knock on that door. And she would demand answers. The next morning, Margaret drove through the neighborhood slowly, noting details she'd missed the day before. Children's bikes in driveways. School zone signs. A community that had been home to her family while she'd believed they were on another continent. She parked in front of the house with blue shutters and studied the details. A small garden of roses along the front walk, expertly maintained. A mailbox painted to match the shutters. A wooden sign hanging from the porch that read the Hartley family in cheerful script. The same last name they'd always had. They hadn't even tried to hide. Margaret walked to the front door on legs that felt disconnected from her body. She raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. What if they called the police? What if David truly wanted nothing to do with her? What if there was some good reason for all of this deception? But the image of her grandson's face, so achingly familiar yet completely unknown to her, pushed her forward. She knocked 3 times, firmly. Footsteps approached from inside. The door opened. David stood in the doorway, and his face went completely white. His mouth opened and closed without sound. His eyes darted past her to the street, then back to her face, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "Mom!" His voice was barely a whisper. "Hello, David." For a moment, neither of them moved. Margaret took in the details of her son's face, noting the new lines around his eyes, the slight gray at his temples. He looked tired. Older than his 45 years. "You can't be here," David said suddenly, his voice gaining strength. "You need to leave. Right now." "David, No." He stepped back, starting to close the door. "Who's at the door?" Jennifer's voice called from somewhere inside the house. David's face went even paler. "Nobody." Just someone selling something. David, please, Margaret said. I saw Adam yesterday. I know you've been living here. I know you never went to Australia. The door opened wider, and Jennifer appeared behind David. She saw Margaret and her face crumpled with what looked like fear. How did you find us? Jennifer whispered. Mom. Another voice, young and curious. Adam appeared in the hallway behind his parents, still wearing pajama pants and a t-shirt. Who is it? David turned sharply. Go upstairs, Adam. Now. But Dad. Now. Adam's eyes met Margaret's over his father's shoulder. She saw recognition flicker across his features, though she couldn't imagine where he might have seen her before. Is that the lady from Costco? Adam asked. The one who looked like she was going to faint. Inside. Both of you. David's voice was sharp with panic. Margaret stepped forward before he could close the door. Adam, I'm your grandmother. Your father's mother. The words hung in the air like smoke. Adam's eyes widened. Jennifer made a small sound that might have been a sob. David stood frozen between them all, his hand still on the door. But you're dead, Adam said quietly. Dad said you died when I was little. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She staggered backward, her hand reaching for the porch railing to steady herself. I told him you moved to Florida after Grandpa Paul died, David said quickly, not meeting her eyes. I told him you were too sad to stay in touch. You told everyone I was dead, Margaret said. It wasn't a question. She could see the truth in David's face. Please leave, Jennifer whispered. Please just go. 15 years, Margaret said, her voice growing stronger. 15 years I've been sending money to Australia. 15 years of birthday cards and Christmas presents. 15 years of missing my grandson's entire childhood because you lied to me. There were reasons, David started. What reasons? Margaret's voice rose. What possible reasons could justify this? Adam moved closer to the door, his teenage curiosity overriding his parents' panic. You've been sending me presents. All this time. Every birthday. Every Christmas. I have pictures of everything I sent, hoping someday I'd get to see you open them. Adam, go to your room, Jennifer said firmly. No way. Adam crossed his arms. This is about me. I want to hear this. Margaret looked at her grandson, really looked at him. He had David's stubborn streak, the same defiant tilt of the chin when challenged. But there was something else in his expression. A hunger for information. A need to understand. I never stopped loving you, she told him. Not for a single day. Tears spilled down Jennifer's cheeks. David's shoulders sagged. Please, David said quietly. Just, give us some time. This is complicated. 15 years wasn't enough time? Margaret asked. She turned and walked back to her car, her legs shaking with adrenaline and heartbreak. As she drove away, she saw Adam watching from an upstairs window. He raised his hand in a small wave. It was the first acknowledgement she'd received from her grandson since he was 6 months old. That afternoon, Margaret sat in the office of Frank Morrison, private investigator. The man came highly recommended by her attorney, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to family mysteries. I need to understand what happened, Margaret told him. Why they lied. Why they've been hiding from me for 15 years. Frank took notes as she explained about the Australian post office box, the money transfers, the complete fabrication of their new life. He nodded thoughtfully when she described David's reaction to seeing her. Fear, he said simply. Your son was afraid of you being there. The question is why? I've never hurt him. I've never done anything but love him and want to be part of his life. I believe you. But something happened 15 years ago to make them go to these lengths. People don't usually fake moving to another country without a serious reason. Frank's investigation moved quickly. Within 3 days, he had a preliminary report that made Margaret's head spin. David had never worked for any company in Australia. His employment records showed he'd been at Davidson Electronics, 30 minutes from Margaret's house, for the past 12 years. Before that, he'd worked at 2 other local companies. The Australian post office box did exist, but it forwarded all mail to a local address. The address belonged to Jennifer's mother, who had died 3 years ago from cancer. The money Margaret had sent for Adam's education fund had paid for Jennifer's mother's treatment and final care. Over $40,000 in total. "There's something else," Frank said when Margaret came in for the full briefing. "Your son has been telling people his mother is dead. At work, at his son's school, in their neighborhood. Everyone knows him as someone whose mother passed away years ago." Margaret stared at the documents spread across Frank's desk. Employment records. School registration forms. Medical insurance papers. All of them listed David's mother as deceased. "But I found something interesting about 15 years ago," Frank continued. "Right around the time Adam was born, there was a restraining order filed against you by Jennifer Hartley. But it was dropped within 48 hours. A restraining order? That's impossible. I never threatened anyone. I was helping with the baby. I was recovering from hip surgery myself." Frank showed her the paperwork. Jennifer's signature. A request for protection from harassment and threats. Then, 2 days later, a voluntary dismissal. "You don't remember any conflict with Jennifer during that visit?" Margaret searched her memory. Those weeks after Adam's birth were hazy with pain medication and the exhaustion of trying to help with a newborn while managing her own recovery. Paul had insisted on coming to help, even though Margaret had suggested they hire a nurse instead. "My husband was there," she said slowly. "Paul was very involved in helping with the baby." Something cold settled in Margaret's stomach. Frank was watching her carefully. "Mrs. Patterson, I need to ask you something directly. Did your husband ever behave inappropriately toward your daughter-in-law?" The question hung between them. Margaret felt the room tilt slightly. Paul can be flirtatious. Overly familiar. But he would never. She stopped. She couldn't finish the sentence because she wasn't sure it was true. "I think you need to have a conversation with Jennifer," Frank said gently. "Alone." Margaret waited outside Adam's school the next afternoon, her heart pounding. She'd called in sick to work, something she hadn't done in years. When she saw Jennifer's silver Honda in the pickup line, she walked over and knocked on the passenger window. Jennifer looked up and her face went pale. She glanced around, then reluctantly unlocked the door. Margaret slid into the passenger seat. The car smelled like vanilla air freshener and teenage boy, a combination of cologne and sports equipment. "Please don't do this here," Jennifer whispered. "Then where? When?" "It's been 15 years, Jennifer. 15 years of lies and silence. I need to understand why." Jennifer's hands gripped the steering wheel. Other parents chatted in groups on the sidewalk, waiting for their children. Normal families living normal lives. "You really don't know?" Jennifer asked. "Know what?" Jennifer turned to look at her directly. Her eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted. "Ask your husband why we really left. Ask him what he did to me while you were recovering from your surgery." The cold feeling in Margaret's stomach spread through her entire body. "What are you talking about?" "He cornered me in the nursery while you were sleeping off your pain medication. He said things. Did things. When I told him to stop, he said no one would believe me. He said you'd choose him over me and David would lose his mother. Margaret's vision blurred. She remembered Paul's insistence on helping during those weeks. His unusual attentiveness to Jennifer and the baby. His irritation when Margaret tried to do more herself. When I threatened to tell David anyway, Paul showed me something. A DNA test he'd run on Adam without anyone knowing. He said if I ever told anyone what happened, he'd tell David the results and destroy our marriage. What results? Margaret whispered. Jennifer's voice broke. David isn't Paul's biological son. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She doubled over in the passenger seat, gasping for air. Paul has known for 15 years that David isn't his son. He's been using it to control our entire family. When I filed that restraining order, Paul threatened to tell David everything and make sure he blamed me for breaking up the family. So I dropped it. We moved here, changed schools, started over. And Paul made sure we could never really be free. Margaret straightened slowly. Her mind raced through decades of memories, recontextualizing moments she'd attributed to Paul's difficult personality or work stress. His treatment of David. His subtle undermining of her relationship with her son. His control over family finances and decisions. The money I sent went to my mother's cancer treatment. Paul demanded updates on how we spent every dollar. He said if we ever stopped taking it, he'd know we were planning to cut contact completely and he'd tell David about the DNA results. Tears streamed down Margaret's face. Jennifer, I'm so sorry. I never knew. I never suspected. I know you didn't. That's why this was so hard. You're a good person, Margaret. You raised a wonderful son. But Paul. Jennifer shook her head. Paul has been poisoning everything for years. Students began emerging from the school building. Jennifer wiped her eyes and tried to compose herself. There's something else, she said quietly. Adam knows something is wrong. He's been asking questions about you since he was little. He found some of your letters in my mother's things after she died. He knows we've been lying to him. Margaret saw Adam walking toward the car, his backpack slung over one shoulder. When he saw her in the passenger seat, he stopped walking. Other students flowed around him as he stood motionless on the sidewalk. He deserves to know the truth, Margaret said. He deserves a lot of things, Jennifer replied. But telling him might destroy everything we've tried to protect him from. Margaret got out of the car before Adam reached them. She walked toward her grandson, noting how much he'd grown even in the few days since she'd first seen him. He was going to be tall like David. Like the men in her family. Hi, Adam. You're really my grandmother? He looked her up and down, as if checking for family resemblances. I really am. And you've been alive this whole time? Just living here in town? About 20 minutes away from your house. Adam absorbed this information with the quick adaptation of a teenager accustomed to adult disappointments. So my parents have been lying to me my entire life. It's complicated, Margaret said, echoing David's words from the day before. That's what adults always say when they screw up. Adam's voice carried a bitterness that seemed too old for his years. Margaret made a decision that would change everything. Would you like to come to my house? See where your dad grew up? I have photo albums. Stories. Things I've been saving to tell you someday. Adam glanced back at his mother, who was watching them through the car window. Jennifer gave a small nod. Yeah, Adam said. I'd like that. Margaret's house felt different with Adam in it. The family photos on the mantelpiece suddenly had context again. The guest room she'd kept ready for visits that never came suddenly had purpose. Adam studied the pictures with the intensity of an archaeologist examining artifacts. Photos of David at every age, including several where the family resemblance to Adam was startling. "He looks just like me," Adam said, holding up a picture of 16-year-old David. "The scar too," Margaret pointed out. "It runs in our family. My grandmother had it. My father. David. Now you." Adam touched the small crescent above his eyebrow. "I always wondered about this. Mom said it was from falling off my bike when I was little, but I remember that fall and I didn't hit my face." Margaret showed him David's childhood room, which she'd kept largely unchanged. Sports trophies lined the shelves. A poster of Michael Jordan hung above the desk. A collection of model airplanes dangled from fishing line attached to the ceiling. "He wanted to be a pilot," Margaret said, "before he discovered computers." Adam sat on the bed and looked around. "This feels weird. Like visiting a museum about a father I don't really know." "What do you mean?" "Dad doesn't talk about his childhood. Ever. When I ask about it, he changes the subject. I always thought it was because you died and it made him too sad." Margaret sat beside her grandson on David's old bed. "What else don't you know about him?" "Pretty much everything. Mom tells stories sometimes, but Dad gets upset when she does. It's like he doesn't want to remember anything from before I was born." They spent 2 hours going through photo albums. Margaret told stories about David's childhood pranks, his fear of thunder, his obsession with magic tricks when he was 12. Adam absorbed every detail with hungry attention. "Why did you stop being part of our lives?" Adam asked finally. Margaret had been dreading this question. The truth was complicated and ugly and would hurt everyone involved. But Adam deserved more than 15 years of lies. "Your grandfather Paul did something terrible to your mother when you were a baby. Your parents moved away to protect you and themselves. They told me you were moving to Australia so I wouldn't look for you." Adam was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Grandpa Paul is still alive, isn't he?" "Yes." "Is he the reason Dad gets that look on his face whenever someone mentions family?" Margaret realized her grandson was far more perceptive than anyone had given him credit for. "What look?" "Like he's afraid of something. Like he's waiting for something bad to happen." Before Margaret could answer, her phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen. "Don't answer it," Adam said quickly. "Not yet." But Margaret was already accepting the call. "Where is he?" David's voice was tight with panic. "He's safe. He's with me. Bring him home. Right now." "David. I mean it, Mom. Bring him home or I'm calling the police." The line went dead. Adam had heard enough to understand the situation. "I should go," he said quietly. "You don't have to. You're old enough to make some of your own decisions." Adam looked around David's childhood room one more time. "No, I should go. But..." He pulled out his phone. "Can I have your number? Maybe we could text sometimes." Margaret gave him her contact information, her heart full of more hope than she'd felt in 15 years. As they drove back toward Adam's house, he said, "Grandma? Whatever Grandpa Paul did, it wasn't your fault, was it?" "I don't think so. But I should have known. I should have protected your parents better. Adults always think they should have known things they couldn't have known. My mom does the same thing." Margaret parked in front of the house with blue shutters. David's car was already in the driveway. Through the front windows, she could see him pacing in the living room. "Are you going to be okay?" she asked Adam. "Yeah. But are you?" The question caught her off guard. "What do you mean?" "You've been alone for 15 years thinking we didn't want you. That's got to hurt." Margaret's throat tightened. It did hurt. But seeing you, getting to know you even a little bit, it was worth the wait. Adam smiled for the first time since she'd met him. It was David's smile, but warmer somehow. Less guarded. "I'll text you," he promised, getting out of the car. Margaret watched him walk to the front door. Instead of going inside immediately, he turned and waved. She waved back, then drove home through streets that felt less empty than they had in years. That evening, Margaret sat in her husband Paul's study, looking through his filing cabinets. She'd never had reason to search through his personal papers before. Paul handled all their finances, their taxes, their important documents. She'd been content to let him manage those details while she focused on her teaching career and their children. But Jennifer's revelations had shifted something fundamental in Margaret's understanding of her marriage. If Paul had been capable of what Jennifer described, what else might he have hidden? The first filing cabinet contained standard documents. Tax returns, insurance policies, mortgage papers. The second cabinet was locked. Margaret searched Paul's desk until she found a small key taped to the underside of the bottom drawer. Her hands shook as she unlocked the cabinet. The first folder contained DNA test results. Not just one test, but dozens. David's results from 15 years ago, as Jennifer had described. But there were more recent tests too. Results for their daughter Katie, dated from 5 years ago. Results for their youngest son Michael from 3 years ago. Margaret's legs gave out. She sank into Paul's leather chair and stared at the papers. According to the tests, David and Katie were not Paul's biological children. Only Michael was Paul's son. The second folder contained correspondence with a private investigator. Reports detailing David and Jennifer's activities over the past 15 years. Photos of Adam at various ages, playing soccer, walking to school, celebrating birthdays. Paul had been monitoring their lives while pretending they were in Australia. The third folder made Margaret physically ill. Photos of other women. Correspondence that suggested Paul had been involved in multiple affairs over the years. And notes in Paul's handwriting that referenced insurance and leverage and control mechanisms. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Hi Grandma, it's Adam. Thanks for today. Can we do it again sometime?" She typed back with trembling fingers. "Anytime you want, sweetheart. Can I ask you something? Do you think people can change? Like, if someone did something really bad, could they become a better person?" Margaret stared at the question for a long time. Around her, Paul's secret files contained 15 years of manipulation, surveillance, and control. Evidence of a man who had systematically destroyed his family's ability to trust or love freely. "I think people can change if they want to," she typed back. "But first they have to admit they need to change. Do you think my dad could change? Could we be a normal family?" Margaret's heart broke for her grandson, who had spent 16 years navigating a family dynamic he didn't understand, wondering why his father seemed afraid of happiness. "Your dad is a good person who has been living with some very difficult secrets. Maybe it's time for those secrets to come out into the light." "Maybe it is." Margaret made a decision. She took photos of every document in Paul's filing cabinet, then carefully returned everything to its original position. She locked the cabinet and replaced the key exactly where she'd found it. Tomorrow, she would call David and Jennifer. She would arrange a meeting where the truth could finally be told. And she would make sure Paul could never use his leverage to control anyone again. But first, she had 15 years of silence to break. Margaret called David the next morning and asked him to meet her for coffee. "Neutral territory," she explained. "Just the two of them." They needed to talk. David arrived at the coffee shop looking like he hadn't slept. His hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled. He scanned the room nervously before sitting across from her in a corner booth. "Mom, about yesterday. I know about Paul, Margaret said quietly. David's face went white. Know about what? I know what he did to Jennifer when Adam was born. I know about the DNA tests. I know he's been blackmailing your family for 15 years. David's hands shook as he reached for his coffee cup. How could you know that? Because I went through his files last night. Because Jennifer told me. Because I should have seen it years ago, but I was blind to who my husband really is. Tears spilled down David's cheeks. Mom, I wanted to tell you. So many times. But he said if anyone found out, he'd destroy everything. He'd tell everyone about the DNA results and make sure you chose him over me. David, listen to me. You are my son. Biology doesn't change that. You are my firstborn, my baby, the child I raised and loved and worried about for 45 years. Nothing Paul could say or do would ever change that. David broke down completely. The careful control he'd maintained for 15 years crumbled in the middle of a busy coffee shop. Margaret moved to his side of the booth and held him while he sobbed. I was so scared, he whispered. I was scared he'd turn you against me. I was scared he'd tell Adam that his father was a bastard. I was scared Jennifer would leave me if she knew I'd chosen to protect Paul's secret instead of protecting her. Jennifer loves you. She's been protecting you just as much as you've been protecting her. But the things he said to her, the things he did, I should have known. I should have protected her. You were dealing with a new baby and a mother recovering from surgery and a manipulative man who specializes in psychological control. You were 29 years old trying to hold your family together. You did the best you could with the information you had. They sat in silence for a while, David's head on his mother's shoulder like when he was a little boy. What happens now? He asked finally. Now we stop letting Paul control our lives, Margaret said. Now we tell the truth. That evening, Margaret invited David, Jennifer, and Adam to dinner at her house. She also sent a text to her daughter Katie, asking her to come. And to her youngest son Michael, though she wasn't sure how much to tell him yet. Paul would be working late, as he always did on Thursdays. By the time he came home, Margaret planned to have changed the locks and moved his belongings to the garage. She'd already spoken to an attorney about protecting her assets and filing for divorce. Katie arrived first, full of questions about why Margaret had suddenly requested a family dinner after years of David being too busy to attend gatherings. Where's David been living? Katie asked. I tried to visit him a few years ago, but Paul said they'd moved and didn't want contact with anyone here. Margaret felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. Paul told you David didn't want contact with you? He said David was still angry about my divorce. That he thought I'd made a mistake leaving Tom and didn't want to hear from me until I got my life together. More lies. More control. Margaret wondered how many other family relationships Paul had sabotaged over the years. When David, Jennifer, and Adam arrived, the house felt more alive than it had in decades. Adam immediately gravitated toward the family photos, pointing out details to his parents that he'd learned the day before. Did you know Dad was afraid of thunder until he was 12? Adam asked Jennifer. Your father is still afraid of thunder, Jennifer replied, smiling. He just hides in the bathroom now instead of under his bed. Katie stared at Adam with amazement. You look exactly like David did at your age. Exactly like him. That's what Grandma said. She showed me pictures. Grandma? Katie looked confused. Adam, honey, your grandmother lives in Florida. She's been too sad to visit since Grandpa Paul's father died. The room went quiet. Adam looked at his parents, then back at Katie. Aunt Katie, he said carefully, Grandma Margaret lives 20 minutes away from our house. Grandpa Paul isn't dead. And Dad has been lying to everyone about pretty much everything. Katie's confusion deepened. She looked to David for explanation, but he was staring at his hands. Margaret took a deep breath. Katie, there are some things about our family that you need to know. Things about Paul. Things about why David really moved away 15 years ago. Over the next hour, the truth came out in pieces. Margaret explained about Paul's behavior toward Jennifer. David revealed the DNA test results and the years of blackmail. Jennifer described the restraining order and the threats. Adam shared his growing suspicions that his family was living a lie. Katie listened with increasing shock and anger. He told me David hated me. He told me you were too heartbroken about David leaving to talk about him. He's been keeping us all separated for years. It's worse than that, Margaret said. She showed them photos of Paul's secret files. The surveillance reports. The other women. The systematic manipulation of their entire family. How long has this been going on? Katie asked. I think it started before you were born, Margaret said quietly. I think Paul has been controlling and manipulating our family for over 20 years. Adam, who had been listening to the adult conversation with mature attention, suddenly looked up from his phone. Grandma, I just Googled something. Did you know Grandpa Paul has been married before? The room fell silent. What do you mean? Margaret asked. Adam showed them his phone screen. I searched his name plus marriage records like they do on TV. He was married to someone named Linda Morrison from 1978 to 1985. But he married you in 1983. So he was married to two people at the same time for 2 years. Margaret felt the room spin. She grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself. That's not possible, she whispered. But even as she said it, she knew it was. Paul's frequent business trips in the early years of their marriage. His insistence on handling all the paperwork for their wedding. His reluctance to discuss his past or his family. There's more, Adam said, reading from his phone. Linda Morrison filed for divorce citing adultery and bigamy. And look at this, she had 2 kids with him. A son named Robert, born in 1982, and a daughter named Lisa, born in 1984. Margaret had been married to Paul for over 40 years. They'd raised 3 children together. She'd built her entire adult life around a man who had been living multiple lives simultaneously. Mom, are you okay? David reached for her hand. Margaret looked around the table at her family. Her son, who had been terrorized into hiding for 15 years. Her daughter-in-law, who had endured harassment and threats. Her daughter, who had been isolated from her brother through lies. And her grandson, who was discovering that his entire childhood had been built on deception. I'm not okay, Margaret said honestly. But I'm going to be. Jennifer spoke up quietly. There's something else we need to tell you. Something I discovered last week. She pulled out her phone and opened a video file. Adam helped me set up a recording app. We've been documenting some things, just in case. The video showed Paul in their kitchen, talking to someone on the phone. His voice was clear through the phone speaker. She's getting suspicious, Paul was saying. Margaret's been asking questions about the Australia thing. We might need to relocate them again. Another voice responded, too muffled to understand clearly. No, they can't go to the police. I have too much on them. The DNA results, the restraining order, the money trail. They try anything, I'll destroy David's reputation and make sure he loses his job. Margaret's hands clenched into fists. Paul's voice continued. Besides, I've got the Morrison situation handled. Linda's been quiet for years. A little financial pressure goes a long way. The video ended. The room was silent except for the sound of Margaret's rapid breathing. When was this recorded? She asked. 3 days ago, Jennifer said. Right after Adam saw you at Costco. Paul called someone immediately after David told him you'd been to the house. Adam leaned forward. Grandma, who's Linda Morrison? Margaret closed her eyes. Apparently, she's Paul's first wife. A wife he never divorced before marrying me. Katie stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. This is insane. Our entire family has been living a lie for decades. How do we even begin to fix this? We start by calling the police, Margaret said firmly. Mom, no, David protested. If Paul gets arrested, all of this comes out publicly. The bigamy, the DNA results, everything. Adam will have to deal with reporters and questions and… Dad, Adam interrupted. I'm 16. I can handle knowing the truth about my family. What I can't handle is more lies. Margaret looked at her grandson with pride. Despite everything, he was showing remarkable strength and maturity. Adam's right, she said. The lies stop tonight. Margaret excused herself to make a phone call to her attorney, who connected her with a family law specialist and a criminal defense lawyer. Within an hour, they had a plan. The lawyers would review Paul's files for evidence of fraud, blackmail, and bigamy. Margaret would file for divorce immediately and seek a restraining order. Jennifer would refile her harassment complaint with the police, this time with the recorded evidence to support her claims. Most importantly, they would do everything possible to protect Adam from the media attention that would inevitably follow. When Margaret returned to the dining room, she found her family had reorganized themselves. Katie and Jennifer were looking through photo albums together, sharing stories about David's childhood. Adam was helping David set up a new phone with a different number, one Paul couldn't monitor. I called Michael, Katie said. I told him there was a family emergency and asked him to come over. What did you tell him? Just that we needed to talk to him about Dad. He sounded worried, but he's coming. Michael arrived 20 minutes later, full of concern about the mysterious family meeting. At 25, he was the youngest of Margaret's children and the only one who still had a close relationship with Paul. His face went through a series of emotions as the family explained the situation. Disbelief, anger, confusion. Finally, a deep sadness that seemed to age him several years in the span of an hour. I don't understand, he said finally. Dad always said he was protecting our family. He said David was selfish for moving away and not staying in touch. He said Katie was irresponsible and needed tough love to get her life together. He was manipulating all of us, David said gently. Making sure we couldn't compare stories or support each other. Michael pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. I need to call Linda Morrison. You know her? Margaret asked, surprised. Dad's been sending her money every month for as long as I can remember. He said she was an old family friend who fell on hard times. I helped him set up the automatic transfers. The room fell silent again. Margaret felt like she was uncovering a new layer of deception every few minutes. Michael, she said carefully, do you know why your father was sending Linda money? He said her husband died and left her with medical bills. But… Michael paused, looking confused. Now that I think about it, she has the same last name as Dad. Morrison was Dad's name before he changed it to Patterson when he married you. Margaret's world tilted again. Paul's name wasn't always Patterson. I thought you knew that. He changed it when you got married. Said he wanted a fresh start. So Paul Morrison had become Paul Patterson when he married Margaret, effectively erasing his previous identity and marriage. It was another layer of calculated deception. Adam, who had been quietly taking in all these revelations, suddenly straightened in his chair. Wait. If Grandpa Paul was already married when he married Grandma Margaret, and if he had kids with his first wife, Doesn't that mean Uncle Michael has half-siblings he's never met? Michael's face went pale. I have a half-brother and half-sister. According to the records Adam found, yes, Margaret said. Robert and Lisa Morrison. And they think their father is dead, Jennifer added. Because that's probably what Paul told them when he abandoned them to start a new family. The scope of Paul's deception was staggering. 3 families, all damaged by his lies and manipulation. Children who didn't know they had siblings. A woman who had been paying for non-existent medical bills that were actually hush money. Margaret's phone rang. The caller ID showed Paul's office number. Everyone in the room tensed. Don't answer it, David said quickly. But Margaret was done hiding. She answered the call and put it on speaker. Margaret, where is everyone? Paul's voice filled the room. I came home and the house is empty. Katie's car is in the driveway but no one's answering the door. We're having a family dinner, Margaret said calmly. All of us. Together. There was a pause. All of you? Where? That's not important right now, Paul. What's important is that I know the truth. Another pause, longer this time. When Paul spoke again, his voice had changed. The familiar warmth was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. What truth is that, Margaret? I know about Linda. I know about the bigamy. I know about what you did to Jennifer. I know about the DNA tests and the blackmail. I know about the surveillance and the manipulation. I know everything. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Where are you? Paul's voice was now openly threatening. Somewhere you can't reach us, Margaret said. And somewhere you can't hurt anyone anymore. Margaret, you're making a very serious mistake. Think about what you're risking. Think about your family's reputation. Think about David's career. Think about Adam's future. I'm thinking about all of those things. That's why I'm doing this. I can destroy all of you. You know I can. Margaret looked around the table at her family. David had his arm around Jennifer's shoulders. Katie was holding Adam's hand. Michael looked determined despite his obvious pain. No, Paul. You can't. Not anymore. She hung up the phone. He's going to come here, David said immediately. We need to leave. No, Margaret said firmly. He's not coming here. He's going to run. She was right. Within an hour, they received a call from Margaret's neighbor saying Paul had returned home, loaded his car with suitcases, and driven away without a word. By the time the police arrived to execute the restraining order, Paul Morrison Patterson was gone. The next morning, Margaret woke up in her own bed for the first time in weeks without the weight of secrets pressing against her chest. Sunlight streamed through windows Paul had always insisted on keeping covered with heavy curtains. She made coffee in the kitchen where her grandson had eaten breakfast the night before, staying over in David's old room, where Jennifer had helped her pack away Paul's remaining belongings, where Katie had spent hours on the phone with investigators, providing details about years of suspicious behavior. Adam appeared in the doorway, already dressed for school. Morning, Grandma, he said, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. Good morning, sweetheart. How did you sleep? Better than I have in years, actually. It's weird not having to worry about someone listening to our conversations. Margaret poured him a glass of orange juice and started making pancakes. It felt like the most normal thing in the world, and also like a miracle. Are you nervous about school? She asked. About people finding out about all this? Adam shrugged with teenage nonchalance. Some people are going to be jerks about it no matter what. But I'd rather deal with jerks who know the truth than pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. David and Jennifer appeared shortly after, looking more rested than Margaret had seen them in years. Any word from the lawyers? David asked. Linda Morrison wants to meet with us, Margaret said. She's been wondering for years why Paul suddenly started sending her money. She thought it was guilt money for abandoning her and the kids. It was, Jennifer said. Just not the kind of guilt she thought. Over breakfast, they made plans for the future. David and Jennifer would put their house on the market and move closer to Margaret. Adam would transfer schools, finally able to use his real family history on applications. Katie would introduce Adam to his cousins, her own children who had never met their Uncle David. Michael had the hardest path ahead. He was planning to reach out to Robert and Lisa Morrison, his half-siblings who didn't know he existed. The family therapist Margaret had contacted would help navigate those conversations. But first, there was a more immediate concern. The reporters are going to start calling today, Margaret said. The bigamy charges are public record now. Are we all prepared for that? Adam looked up from his pancakes. I've been thinking about that. What if we got ahead of the story instead of just reacting to it? What do you mean? Jennifer asked. I mean, what if we told our version first? Not to get famous or anything, but to control the narrative. Show that we're the victims who fought back, not just a family torn apart by scandal. Margaret studied her grandson's face. At 16, he was showing more wisdom and strategic thinking than she'd seen from adults twice his age. That's actually not a bad idea, David said slowly. If we're proactive about it, we can focus on the important parts. The manipulation, the psychological abuse, the way he isolated family members from each other. And, Adam added, maybe we can help other families who are going through similar things. There have to be other people being controlled by someone like Grandpa Paul. Margaret felt a surge of pride so strong it brought tears to her eyes. This young man, who had been lied to his entire life, was thinking about how to help others avoid the same pain. I think that's exactly what we should do, she said. The doorbell rang. Through the front window, Margaret could see a woman with graying hair standing on the porch, holding the hand of a teenage girl. I think that's Linda Morrison, David said, checking his phone. She said she wanted to meet us in person. Margaret opened the door to face the woman who had technically been Paul's wife longer than she had. Linda Morrison was elegantly dressed despite the early hour, with kind eyes that looked tired in a familiar way. The teenage girl beside her had Paul's distinctive jawline but softer features. Mrs. Patterson? I'm Linda Morrison. This is my daughter Lisa. Please, come in. And call me Margaret. As they settled in the living room, Lisa looked around with obvious curiosity. This is so weird, she said. Our dad lived here. Slept here. Had family dinners here. While he was supposed to be having family dinners with us, Adam added. Lisa and Adam studied each other with the fascination of siblings who had just discovered each other's existence. Despite the circumstances, Margaret could see the beginning of a genuine connection. Linda accepted a cup of coffee and sat carefully on the edge of the couch. I need to apologize, she said. I suspected for years that Paul was hiding something. When he disappeared in 1985, I hired a private investigator. I found out about your marriage, about your children. I could have exposed him then, but he threatened you, Margaret finished. Linda nodded. He said if I ever told anyone, he'd make sure I lost custody of Robert and Lisa. He had lawyers, money, connections I didn't have. I was a single mother working 2 jobs. I couldn't risk it. So he's been controlling all of us for decades, Jennifer said. And collecting money from me for medical bills that never existed, Linda added. I should have known better, but he was very convincing. He always was. Lisa spoke up. Mom, show them the letters. Linda pulled a manila envelope from her purse. Paul has been writing to me for 20 years. Apology letters, explanation letters, birthday cards for the kids. I saved them all. She handed the envelope to Margaret. I thought you might want to see them. They show a pattern of manipulation going back much further than any of us realized. Margaret opened the first letter, dated 15 years ago, right around the time Adam was born. My dearest Linda, it began. I hope this letter finds you and the children well. I know my leaving was sudden, but I had no choice. Margaret has been threatening to expose our family if I don't cut all ties with you. She's a jealous woman who can't bear the thought of sharing me, even with my own children. Margaret's hands shook as she read. Even in his letters to Linda, Paul had been creating lies to manipulate her emotions and maintain control. He told me you were the one keeping him away from us, Linda said quietly. He said you'd threatened to divorce him and take his children if he maintained contact with Robert and Lisa. Just like he told me you were a bitter ex-girlfriend trying to cause trouble in our marriage, Margaret replied. The two women looked at each other across the decades of lies that had kept them apart. How many other people do you think he's manipulated like this? Linda asked. Before anyone could answer, Michael's phone rang. He'd been unusually quiet all morning, processing the reality of having siblings he'd never met. It's Robert, he told the room before answering. My half-brother. He put the call on speaker. A young man's voice filled the room. Michael? This is really strange, but I got your message. You said you're my half-brother? Yeah. Our father is Paul Morrison. He was married to your mother when he married my mother. We just found out about each other yesterday. Holy shit, Robert's voice was shaky. Sorry. I mean, this is a lot to process. I'm 26 years old and I'm just now finding out I have 3 half-siblings. It's been a shocking week for all of us, Michael said gently. Is our father still alive? Yes, but he's disappeared. We filed charges yesterday for fraud and bigamy. The whole family has been living under his lies for decades. There was a long pause. Then Robert's voice returned, stronger. Good. I hope they throw him in jail. Do you know he told our mom he was dying of cancer to get money from her? For 20 years, she's been sending money for his treatment. She went without things she needed because she thought she was helping him survive. Margaret closed her eyes. The scope of Paul's deception seemed to grow with every conversation. Robert, she said, this is Margaret, your father's. Well, I guess his second wife, though I didn't know Linda was his first. Would you and Lisa like to come meet the rest of the family? I think we all have a lot to talk about. Yeah, Robert said. Yeah, I'd like that. Lisa's been wanting to know about her other siblings her whole life. As Margaret hung up, she realized her house was about to become very crowded. 7 family members, spanning 3 generations, all connected by one man's web of lies and all determined to build something honest from the wreckage. Adam looked around the room at this expanded definition of family. This is going to be complicated, he said. Yes, it is, Margaret agreed. But complicated isn't the same as impossible. That afternoon, Margaret's house filled with voices it had never heard before. Robert Morrison turned out to be a software engineer with David's analytical mind and Michael's gentle nature. Lisa was 17, just a year older than Adam, with a fierce intelligence that reminded Margaret of Katie at that age. The adult siblings compared stories, finding patterns in Paul's behavior that stretched back to their childhoods. The teenagers bonded over shared experiences of growing up with an absent father who was simultaneously too controlling when he was present. Linda and Margaret found themselves working together in the kitchen, preparing dinner for a family that had never existed as a whole unit before. I keep thinking I should hate you, Linda said quietly as she chopped vegetables. I keep thinking the same thing, Margaret replied. But you didn't know about me any more than I really knew about you. We were both just trying to protect our children from a man who was fundamentally dishonest. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, two women who had been unknowing rivals for 4 decades and were now tentative allies. What happens now? Linda asked. With all of us, I mean. Margaret considered the question. Through the kitchen doorway, she could see David explaining computer programming to Lisa while Jennifer and Robert looked through photo albums. Adam and Katie were deep in conversation about something that was making them both laugh. Michael sat slightly apart, still processing the reality of his expanded family, but watching the interactions with growing interest. I think we become a real family, Margaret said. Maybe not a traditional one, but a real one. Based on choice instead of obligation. Based on truth instead of lies. Linda smiled. I'd like that. The next morning brought the first reporters. Margaret had been expecting them, but she was still startled by the aggressive knocking on her door at 7 a.m. She opened it to find a young woman with a microphone and a cameraman behind her. Mrs. Patterson? I'm Sarah Chen from Channel 7 News. Can you comment on the bigamy charges filed against your husband Paul Morrison Patterson? Margaret had prepared for this moment. I'd be happy to speak with you, but not on my doorstep. My family and I will be holding a press conference this afternoon at 3 o'clock at the community center. We'll answer all questions then. The reporter looked surprised. Most people in Margaret's situation tried to avoid media attention entirely. Can you give us any preview of what you'll be discussing? We'll be discussing how financial and emotional abuse can happen to anyone, in any family, and how important it is for victims to speak up and support each other. Margaret closed the door before the reporter could ask follow-up questions. By noon, 3 more news crews had appeared on her street. Margaret's phone was ringing constantly with interview requests. But she stuck to her plan. At 3 o'clock, Margaret stood behind a podium in the community center, flanked by David, Jennifer, Adam, Katie, Michael, Linda, Robert, and Lisa. 8 people who 6 months ago had been strangers or estranged family members, now united by their shared experience of Paul's manipulation. Margaret had written her statement carefully, with input from all the family members and approval from their attorney. My name is Margaret Patterson, she began. 6 days ago, I believed my son and grandson were living in Australia. I believed my daughter-in-law had chosen to cut contact with me after a family disagreement. I believed my husband Paul was a devoted father and grandfather who was as heartbroken as I was about our fractured family. She paused, looking out at the reporters and community members who had gathered. All of those beliefs were lies. For over 20 years, my husband systematically manipulated, threatened, and controlled not one family, but 3 families. He used DNA tests, financial pressure, and psychological intimidation to keep us all isolated from each other. Margaret went on to explain the basic facts of Paul's deception without going into the most private details. She talked about the importance of recognizing the signs of psychological abuse. She announced the establishment of a support fund for families dealing with similar manipulation. When she finished speaking, the reporters had dozens of questions. But it was Adam who stepped forward to the microphone. I'm 16 years old, he said. I've spent my entire life thinking my grandmother was dead and my father's family didn't want anything to do with us. I've watched my parents live in fear without understanding why. Yesterday, I met my grandmother for the first time since I was a baby. Today, I met 3 half-aunts and half-uncles I never knew existed. He looked directly into the cameras. If there are other kids out there whose families don't make sense, whose parents seem scared all the time, whose relatives have mysteriously disappeared from their lives, ask questions. Keep asking until you get real answers. Don't let anyone tell you that family dysfunction is normal or acceptable. The press conference lasted an hour. By evening, the story had been picked up by national news outlets. Margaret's phone rang with interview requests from talk shows and magazines. But the call that mattered most came from a woman in Texas. "Mrs. Patterson? My name is Carol Williams. I saw your press conference on the news. I think my husband might be doing some of the same things your husband did. I don't know who else to call." Margaret talked to Carol for 2 hours, providing contact information for lawyers and therapists and support groups. It was the first of many such calls. Over the following weeks, Margaret's house became an unofficial headquarters for what the media had dubbed the Patterson family recovery. Social workers consulted on cases involving family manipulation. Therapists referred clients who were dealing with similar situations. Legal aid organizations reached out for advice on handling complex family fraud cases. But the most important recovery was happening around Margaret's dinner table every Sunday, where 3 generations and 2 previously separate families were learning to trust each other. Adam thrived in his new school, where he could honestly discuss his family history in college application essays. David and Jennifer bought a house 2 miles from Margaret's, close enough for daily visits but far enough for independence. Katie introduced her children to their newly discovered cousins, creating bonds that would last generations. Michael struggled the most with adjusting to the expanded family dynamic, but slowly began building relationships with Robert and Lisa. Linda returned to school to finish the degree she'd abandoned when Paul disappeared, supported financially by the money he'd been extorting from her for decades. And Margaret, at 68, discovered that her real life was just beginning. 6 months after that first encounter at Costco, Margaret stood in her kitchen making Sunday dinner for 12 people. The table had been extended with folding chairs and card tables, but somehow everyone fit. Adam appeared at her elbow, now 17 and several inches taller. "Need help with anything, Grandma?" "Actually, yes. I want to teach you how to make my chocolate chip cookies. The recipe I never got to pass down." They worked side by side, measuring flour and chocolate chips, while the sound of family conversation filled the house. Real conversation, honest and open and sometimes difficult, but always true. "Grandma," Adam said as he stirred the cookie dough. "Yes, sweetheart. Do you think Grandpa Paul will ever come back?" Margaret considered the question. Paul remained a fugitive, though the FBI believed he was somewhere in South America. The family had learned to live with the possibility that he might resurface someday, but they'd also learned they were stronger together than he was alone. "He might," she said honestly. "But if he does, he'll find a very different family than the one he left behind. A family that talks to each other. A family that tells the truth. A family that protects each other instead of keeping secrets." Adam nodded, satisfied with her answer. "Besides," Margaret added, "he'll find a family that includes 9 people instead of just 3. He never planned for that." The oven timer went off. Margaret pulled out the first batch of cookies, golden brown and perfect. Adam immediately reached for one, burning his fingers and laughing. "Some things never change," Margaret said, thinking of all the times David had done exactly the same thing at exactly the same age. "Some things do, though," Adam replied. "And sometimes the changes are better than what came before." Margaret looked through the kitchen doorway at her loud, complicated, honest family gathered around her extended dining room table. Paul's departure had been devastating, but it had also been a liberation. "Yes," she agreed. "Sometimes they really are." The cookies were perfect. The family was imperfect but real. And for the first time in decades, Margaret Patterson felt like she was exactly where she belonged. As the sun set outside her kitchen window, 3 generations of voices filled her house with laughter and stories and plans for the future. Paul had tried to control their past, but he had no power over what they chose to build together. And they chose to build everything he had tried to destroy: trust, honesty, connection, and love that wasn't conditional on secrets or silence. Margaret served warm cookies to her family, watching Adam explain the recipe to his half-cousin Lisa, who was taking careful notes. The tradition would continue, passed down through generations who would know where they came from and who they belonged to. It had taken 68 years, but Margaret had finally learned the difference between a house full of people and a home full of family. The difference, she realized, was the truth.